we anthropologists are often criticized for focusing excessively on sort of micro level questions, but I do hope that this case study, which emphasizes the experiences of banana producers in the Windward Islands and specifically Dominica, will illuminate some of the issues that have been raised by the previous presenters. Many food justice advocates regard fair trade as a moral alternative to markets that are dominated by global agribusiness. The fair trade movement frames producer-consumer relationships in the language of social justice and reciprocity. Fair trade goods typically fetch higher retail prices than their conventional counterparts, and these prices are intended to generate greater earnings for their producers. In addition, a portion of every sale is returned to fair trade producer groups as a social premium for investment in development projects of local design. And one of the goals of the movement is to create alternative circuits of exchange that insulate producers from volatile global markets. Let's see if this. Oh, okay. There we go. All right. In the case study that I'm intending to present here, one dealing with banana growers in the Eastern Caribbean, we'll see that fair trade producers remain vulnerable to a market with its own vagaries, especially as a global recession drives down demand for higher priced fair trade goods. Since the 1950s, the four Commonwealth countries of the Windward Islands have heavily depended on banana exports to the United Kingdom and continental Europe. The region's banana farms are labor-intensive, family-run operations whose average size is less than 1.5 hectares. Despite costs of production that are triple those of Central American bananas, for over 50 years, a complex framework guaranteeing export markets for Caribbean fruit enabled the Windwards to derive most of their export earnings from bananas. In 1992, Dominica had the distinction of being more dependent on bananas than any other nation on earth, with 75% of its foreign exchange derived from banana sales alone. These preferences began to erode with the creation of the single European market in 1993, and they were ended following a 1998 ruling by the World Trade Organization on behalf of the United States. By 2000, Dominica's export earnings had plunged by 70% compared to a decade before, and the country confronted a deepening balance of payments crisis, facing default on its commercial loans. The government turned to the IMF for standby credits in 2001, 2003, and 2005, and it has been under a rigorous structural adjustment program ever since. Among its effects is a reduction in the public workforce, a closure of health clinics, consolidation of schools, an increase in taxes and increased duties on most imported goods. These measures triggered week-long general strike in 2003, as well as shorter, more sporadic protests ever since. What remained of the banana industry was salvaged by extending fair trade certification to the island's farmers, who now export their fruit for high-end niche markets in the United Kingdom. In the words of its advocates, fair trade opposes processes, quote, that devalue, I'm quoting the work of Marilyn Reynolds at at yes, thank you. Yeah, Colorado State, that devalue and exploit disadvantaged peoples and the environment by creating solidarity between regions. Its ideological basis has been identified as one of moral economy, much as E.P. Thompson and James Scott characterized pre-capitalist affirmations of the right of workers and peasants to a degree of economic justice. Gavin Friedel, our host, has described the movement's lofty rhetoric as embracing Christian values, the liberal human and labor rights of the International Labor Organization and the United Nations, and a radical interpretation of the Enlightenment for consumers who embrace these goals and who wouldn't. Fair trade's appeal lies in its ability to engage a new sense of agency through consumption, from the belief that individuals transform their social identities through the things they consume. It is a short step to this conclusion from an advertisement for an English fair trade candy bar that shopping can change the world. Concerted labeling and advertising campaigns of this sort yielded phenomenal growth in fair trade's early years. In 2002, worldwide sales amounted to 510 million US dollars, rising to 1.4 billion in 2005 and 6.5 billion in 2011. Yet aggregate figures mask growing unevenness in demand and consumption, both by commodity type and national market. Demand in more established fair trade markets, such as Britain and continental Europe, has leveled off in recent years. Most recent growth is due to certification of new products and opening of new markets in Eastern Europe and Asia. For commodities such as fresh fruit, juice, and flowers, global sales have actually fallen in recent years. Between 2008 and 2009, sales of fair trade fruit dropped by 24%, another 14% in 2010, and 12% in 2011. These declines reflect a global recession that has dampened consumer demand for higher-priced specialty goods. In addition to receiving a producer price higher than conventional banana farmers, fair trade growers receive a social premium of $1.75 US for each box of fruit that they export. These funds are deposited in an account that pays for education, health, and infrastructural programs in the community where the Fair Trade Farmers Group is based. In this manner, fair trade groups are looked upon to render many of the services formerly provided by the state, but which have been rescinded under structural adjustment. In Dominica, whose poverty levels are about 3 times greater than the other windwards, the potential contributions of premiums to rural areas are not insignificant. Regional leaders, including Dominican Prime Minister Roosevelt Scarrett, have praised fair trade as a way of providing social services that their governments are no longer able to offer to rural communities. Now, I want to take a minute to look at fair trade realities on the ground. Under the environmental protocols that are established by FLOW, or Fair Trade International, most of the chemicals that had formerly been used in commercial banana production are now banned. A few are still permitted to fertilize, control pests, and wash fruit prior to packing. Fair trade farmers are required to record all chemical use, display warning signs in fields that have been sprayed. They are required to wear heavy aprons and gloves and store chemicals under lock and key. Record keeping it's a very formidable, a daunting task in an area where people, on average, farmers have about 4 years of formal education, and many are not even functionally literate. Conformity with these requirements is enforced through inspections by a bewildering array of island-based and European auditors, before annual farm inspections by FLO's auditors. Field officers from the National Fair Trade Organization visit all island farms to conduct internal audits. The 5 supermarket chains that sell Caribbean bananas each have their own codes of social and environmental responsibility, and accordingly, supermarket auditors annually descend on island farms to ensure compliance with these measures. And finally, Windfresh, which is the island's fruit exporter, employs field officers who conduct unannounced farm visits to oversee pest control and compliance with Europe's import requirements. Violation of any of these requirements brings an indefinite suspension of export production, and this is a decision that farmers cannot appeal. Because of the possible confrontation that can result from a spontaneous visit, inspections usually take place when the farmer is not present. And not surprisingly, it is the Windfresh officers who, who are most resented as they speed through banana-producing areas. Thank you. In air-conditioned SUVs. The comments here of Francois, a Calabishi farmer who I interviewed in 2010, are fairly typical. He says the field officers get everything, all of them cruising in their automatic, their Benz, their whatsoever, while the farmers live like dogs. At the time of my 2004 fieldwork, returns from fair trade fruit far outpaced those of the conventional export market. That changed within a few years when Walmart's English subsidiary, Asda, which stocks only Chiquita fruit from Central America, unleashed a retail price war. At one point, Asda's bananas sold for just 1/3 the price of fair trade fruit. Struggling to compete, by 2010, Windfresh was paying its Caribbean growers less than it had 6 years before, despite a 50% increase in fertilizer prices over this time. And on Dominica, over this time, the number of fair trade growers fell from 1,100 in 2004 to just 280 6 years later. Early in the last decade, farmers often said that they submitted to fair trade protocols as part of a bargain, as an exchange for the higher prices that fair trade provides. As the price benefits have dissipated, farmers' anger at fair trade certification has grown, with much of it focused on the auditors who seem to act with arbitrary malice in issuing suspension orders. The allocation of social premiums, too, has come under intense criticism. FLO limits to 30% the amount of social premiums that can be spent on expenditures that benefit farmers, such as subsidies for fertilizer. FLO requires that the rest is used for projects in the broader community. Many now question the fairness of a model of development. Development that shifts the burden for social services from the state to private producers. As the president of one fair trade group explained it, Farmers wonder why they should do things when they don't benefit from it. Certain projects like fixing up roads, that should be what government does because we're paying taxes. Roads and streetlights, that should be government's job, not fair trade's. As social premiums are tied to export volumes and as farmers have fallen out of production, I'll try to wind this up. A market-based strategy for development yields fewer resources. Dominican farmers, as you can see from the slide, generated 1.25 million US dollars in social premiums during 2005. By 2010, that amount had fallen to just 139,000 US dollars. As Rafin, a Dominican farmer, explained, many farmers now view the very term fair trade as a mockery of their current circumstances. From that $1.75 we're getting, the farmer gets just 35 cents from it. You won't help me, but you will help to buy bus, help to buy bus stop, help to build road, help to buy fridge for the health center. You can do all these things, but you can't help me. They must change it from fair trade to unjust trade. In 2005, I wrote that the benefits associated with fair trade translated into a changed outlook in rural communities, yet in that guardedly optimistic context, I also noted the limits to fair trade's promises to transform the global market. Eastern Caribbean realities have always fallen short of fair trade's claims to create a new world of solidarity and mutual respect. Farmers saw little difference between the new standards to which they are held by flow and the previous dictates to which they were subject, all of which they characterize as arbitrary, costly, and rigid. But what distinguished fair trade from these previous directives is that for the first time the benefits in producer prices offset the costs of compliance. When these benefits disappear, as they have since then, all that remains is an authoritarian system of governance. By 2010, the implicit fair trade contract had been broken. Farmers' resentment at this rupture represents a classic illustration of a violated moral economy of the poor. When a price that covered their costs of production could no longer be sustained, fair trade became, in the words of Rafin, as we've seen, unjust trade. The broader lesson here, and I'm about to conclude, is the near impossibility of reforming capitalism from within. Caribbean farmers were told that with the support of socially conscious consumers, the fair trade label would insulate them from a newly deregulated market. It's no fault of fair trade itself, but because of the machinations of Walmart and Chiquita with which fair trade bananas compete, that these promises have been illusory, placed side by side on supermarket shelves with much cheaper but basically equivalent Central American fruit produced under much worse social conditions. Fair trade bananas inevitably feel the downward tug of the global race to the bottom. In the end, the moral sentiments that animate fair trade seem little match for the global market that they set out to reform. Thank you.